All right, let's kick this off, and other people can join in as they will. We have muted mics and cameras for the presentation, but there will be a Q&A session at the end. If you have any questions along the way, please don't forget to use the chat box to put them in so we don't lose track of them. I'm Craig McAtee, the CEO and Executive Director of the National Coalition of Advanced Technology Centers. And over the last few years, we've partnered closely with the National Skills Coalition on a lot of great policy and expertise they bring to the table. And as we have done that, one of our key board of directors, Mark Goldberg, who I'll introduce in a second here, has been the champion of everything in diversity, equity, and inclusion that NCATC has been doing. He is also working on a major grant with the Urban Institute and many other players with NCATC on these key areas. And obviously the digital gap, digital skills needs, literacy across the country is at an all-time high of need and a pretty low ebb for a lot of rural and even urban areas that need upskilling in the population. So without further ado, I want to introduce Mark Goldberg, who's going to introduce our key speakers from the National Skills Coalition. Thanks so much, Mark, for chairing this, and looking forward to hearing the presentation. We are recording, just so everybody knows, and it will be on our website by Monday if you have other people want to see it. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, for the introduction. Nice to see everyone, and really honored to play a small role in this webinar with great colleagues from National Skills Coalition. Just a little bit more context. NCATC last year developed a new committee, a government relations committee, understanding that our network through NCATC of practitioners with advanced technology and workforce development programs across community and technical colleges have expertise in practice, but understanding the importance of policy at the federal, state, and local level. And that's really an area that National Skills Coalition thrives in terms of skills training. And I have had the opportunity to work closely with NSC through the years, doing Hill visits with them and learning so much about the key policy elements of it. Has to do with short-term Pell eligibility or digital equity, and that's the topic of this one. So I won't talk too much here, but want to introduce colleagues from the National Skills Coalition. First, Amanda Berkson-Shilcock, who's a senior fellow at NSC and really a resident expert in all things digital equity, adult education, and immigration. A longstanding colleague who I always learn from. So welcome, Amanda. Thanks for joining us. And then also Patrick Mortier, who's a policy analyst at National Skills Coalition, who conducts research and analysis to advance workforce policies, funding, and systems that increase access to skills training, worker equity, and to help build an inclusive economy. So thank you both, Amanda and Patrick, for joining us and sharing your expertise on this critical issue of digital skills and digital equity. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it to Patrick.
Great. Thanks, Mark. So yeah, I want to say good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining us here today as we discuss the new landscape of digital skills, how it affects career and technical education leaders, and what the latest data and funding reveals as we look to tackle a rapidly changing workplace in America. So first, I want to provide you with a quick snapshot of what we'll be covering today. We're going to talk about how, even before the pandemic, the U.S. labor market and employers have shown a great growing demand for workers across industries to have strong digital skills. We'll then discuss the digital skills needs of workers across all industry sectors and examples of skill building that are worthy of highlighting. And lastly, we'll share some exciting new federal funding opportunities coming down the pike and what CTE leaders can do to stay informed and make the most of this funding. Once again, I want to introduce ourselves. I'm Patrick Mortier, policy analyst with National Skills Coalition. I'm joined again by Amanda Berkson-Shilcock, the senior fellow with National Skills Coalition. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, National Skills Coalition, or NSC, is a big tent bipartisan coalition made up of more than 20,000 members nationwide. And we've been around for over 20 years. We're committed to inclusive, high quality skills training so that more people have access to a better life and more local businesses see sustained growth. And we accomplish state and federal policy changes through our expert analysis and technical assistance, broad-based organizing, target advocacy, and cutting-edge communications. So here's our snapshot of organizations. Our overarching national network is NSC. Underneath that umbrella is our state network ScaleSpan, made up of 20 state affiliate coalitions, Business Leaders United, or BLUE, for workforce partnerships, which is made up of thousands of small and medium-sized business owners in 7 state affiliates. And lastly, Voices for Skills, which consists of tens of thousands of workers and grassroots skills advocates. All right, we're going to start with COVID-19 accelerating the use of tech. And I just want to preface by saying that I know we all experienced the last 2 years together, so we won't dwell too much on the pandemic itself. Really, this is just to ground us and focus on the current state of our workforce. So that we're going to jump right in. All right. So in recent years, we've seen employers rapidly uptake the use of digital technologies, not just in the use of hardware like laptops and tablets, but with software as well, such as digital expense reporting programs or video conferencing platforms that we're all familiar with now. The pace in which these changes have happened was essentially unprecedented. And we saw employees across all workforce sectors adapting to a rapidly changing environment, from paramedics triaging patients via telehealth technology, to retail workers using customized apps to process inventory, to educators moving their classes online with video conferencing platforms. The way in which work was conducted evolved essentially almost overnight. However, the promise of technology providing for a more efficient workplace is only as strong as the digital skills and training that a worker receives. The need to pivot quickly to new systems and digital technologies leaves little time for adequate training. So what we've observed is that from managers to entry-level employees, workers at all levels require digital skills to thrive in an ever-changing workplace. So digital skills demands vary by industry, and it's important to emphasize that digital skill demands are ubiquitous, and virtually every industry would benefit from digital upskilling and training. We also examine this later, but it's important to note that across industries, we see variations on precisely to what degree workers are digitally literate. Now I'm going to pass it over to Amanda, who can give you a few examples.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks so much, Craig and Mark, for inviting us to co-present this presentation with you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how digital skills are actually showing up on the job. For many of you, these are things that you may be seeing and hearing either from your students in your classrooms or from your employer partners, but I think it's helpful to really get tangible and concrete, because people throw around the term digital skills all the time. And sometimes they're talking about very foundational skills, like whether people can comfortably use a mouse or download an app and install it on their phone. Other times they're talking about industry-specific skills. Sometimes they're talking about really high-level skills like data scientists or cybersecurity experts. So it's a big umbrella term and it covers a lot of ground. But let's talk a little bit about what it looks like in some different industries. We heard some really interesting stories from folks working in transportation, distribution, logistics about how there are simple technologies at use in warehouse, things that are just really scanner apps or pickers to help warehouse workers locate inventory. But there's also much more sophisticated technology at play. And so folks in different occupations within the TDL industry really have different digital skill demands. We also heard stories about how the technology demand has changed since the pandemic. I interviewed one person who does training for workers at the port of a major port in the United States. And he mentioned that a lot of their small third-party logistics companies that play a small role in processing the goods that come through the port had been operating with paper delivery manifests before the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit, in the space of about a month, all of these really small employers with 10 or 12 or 20 employees had to pivot very quickly to upgrade to electronic delivery order manifests and really just being able to do everything in electronic environment. So that's just one example of how the kind of growth in digital skills does not happen on a sort of slow, steady, incremental trajectory at all times. Sometimes it happens in these big leaps that are driven by these external events. So in the next slide, you'll see that we also hear in retail and hospitality about growing use of digital skills. We've all seen tablets being used in coffee shops for point of sale transactions and sort of simple exchanges. But depending on the store, workers might also be using an inventory control app. They might be using a price change app. They might have a store issued digital device that they're working on. They might have their own personal device that they're required to use in the workplace. They might be using a company sponsored intranet that gives them visual merchandising instructions, right? How to display the merchandise. We talked to one high-end employer where the supervisor's lack of digital skills was really a bottleneck for the whole team of 5 or 6 workers she was supervising. They're a high-end clothing merchandiser. The company has an in-store intranet that's visible on an iPad. Workers can't access it at home or on their own devices because the company considers it sort of trade secrets. So you can only access it when you're on the job. And because this supervisor wasn't really comfortable with it, she wasn't telling her staff to use it. And so what was happening was there were other teams of other workers working under other managers in the store, and they were having sort of clashes about, well, the display should be handled this way or that way. And the reason there was conflict was because her team was not seeing the visual merchandising instructions from the corporate head office that were being shared on the intranet. So that's one example of how lack of digital skills can really have these ripple effects that don't just affect the worker, but affect sometimes the whole team of people working under them. Next slide. In construction, we see increasingly that building sites are using safety technologies that workers need to be conversant with. They're using blueprint technology apps, other kinds of apps that subcontractors have to be comfortable with. So if they're out on a building site and they submit a work order change or an RFI to the general contractor on the building job, they have to be able to snap a picture with their smartphone and then use one of 5 or 6 different mobile apps that general contractors tend to use to be able to submit that work order change, to be able to say, hey, I as the electrician can't do this until the plumber does their part. And so these are the kinds of ways that even frontline workers, many of whom may not speak English as their first language, might be out in the field with spotty broadband or no broadband and trying to do everything on cell phone data or trying to find a Wi-Fi hotspot. These are really affecting workers at the front lines and often workers in roles that we call essential, although we don't always treat them as essential. And the last example I want to highlight is just the prevalence of IT jobs across almost every industry, right? And so we think of software coding as, well, you might work for a software company or you might work for a bank. You might also work for a hospital or an insurance company. You might work in logistics itself. You might work in retail, right? There's IT roles in essentially every industry. And a really wide range of IT roles, right? From simple help desk roles to more sophisticated database development or website development, data analysis, right? There's a lot of data analytics work happening with folks analyzing data to better understand public health issues. So these are all, not even all, these are a small segment of all the ways that digital skills are really showing up in the US workplace today. We hear these stories in qualitative interviews that we've done with employers, in conversations that we have with workforce providers, career technical education programs, community college, credit-bearing and non-credit courses, including customized workforce training programs, workforce boards. Really anyone who's touching the challenge of upskilling workers right now is in some way intersecting with the challenge of worker skills. And in particular, and you're going to see this a bit in the data that Patrick has to share with you in a minute, we see that a lot of workers have fragmented knowledge, right? So they might be really comfortable texting or even creating a TikTok. That does not necessarily mean they're comfortable using a desktop or laptop computer to operate spreadsheet software, right? Or it doesn't necessarily mean they're comfortable with an electronic health record software package. And so a key aspect for us as educators to think about is how do we help people build bridges from the skills they have to the skills they need? And how do we make sure that they're learning digital skills that are contextualized and closely linked to the subject matter of the topic or the industry that they're training for, right? It really isn't very helpful to send people off to some Microsoft Office class in isolation when what they're actually training for is a career as an allied health professional, right? It's not a bad thing to know sort of basic Office software, but it's often not responsive to the particular needs they're going to have when they actually get into the workforce. So one other big trend that I really wanted to highlight, and you'll see this in the next slide, is the role of career technical education programs, community colleges, and others in helping small and mid-sized businesses to develop training programs and to upskill their workers. We know that big companies can either fund their own in-house upskilling and training programs, or they can march down the street to their local community college and say, hey, listen, we're going to hire 20 CNC operators next year. Could you please, create a training program for CNC operators? Small and mid-sized businesses are generally not hiring for the volume of workers that can allow for that. And so really critical partners are for them to be able to band together with other small and mid-sized businesses in industry sector partnerships, but also to work with education and training partners to come up with sort of problem-solving solutions about not just training their incumbent workforce, but training the talent pipeline of new workers entering into their industry. So as you begin to start hearing some data from Patrick in a moment, the kind of take home I want you to be thinking about in the next slide here is really the critical role that you and your programs and services that you offer are playing in helping workers to develop those in-demand digital skills that I've just been talking about. So I'm going to turn things back over to Patrick now. He's going to share some concrete data with you about what we know about workers' digital skills, and then he'll bounce it back to me for the last segment of our presentation.
Sounds great. Thanks, Amanda. So yeah, like Amanda said, I'm going to take you through some slides that showcase the data around workers' digital skills. And I just want to say that the metrics are derived from a rigorous international data set. And what we did is we went in and pulled out the US data from that particular set. These figures are also from pre-pandemic times. So I'll start with this data here, which is a pretty jarring stat in that almost 1 in 3 workers have limited or no digital skills. Specifically, that's 13% who have no skills and 18% who have limited skills, for a total of 31%. So to elaborate, workers with no digital skills failed to meet 1 or more of the 3 baseline criteria to even take the full digital skills assessment. So prior computer use, willingness to take the computer-based assessment, or an ability to complete 4 out of 6 very basic computer tasks, such as using a mouse or highlighting text on a screen. And people with limited digital skills can complete only very simple digital tasks that have a generic interface and just a few steps. This next slide, in terms of age, it's easy to think that digital skills gaps will disappear as older workers retire from the workforce. In fact, that's absolutely not true. And as you can see from this chart, younger workers, people under the age of 35, highlighted here in the green light color, are a significant percentage within the group of workers who have limited or no digital skills. When we look at other workers' demographics, we find that workers with digital skills gaps come from every race and ethnicity. As you can see from these charts, white workers make up a plurality of those with limited or no skills. And while digital equity issues do disproportionately burden workers of color, the sheer scale of America's workers' digital literacy skill gaps across all races illustrates the need for wide-ranging solutions that are responsive to the full range of workers' demographics and personal characteristics. So we're looking for solutions that have a tailored approach to each one of these characteristics. This chart shows digital skill gaps by industry, and the industries with the highest percentage of workers who have had either limited or no digital skills are at the very top of the list, and the lowest percentage is at the bottom. I think, as we alluded to before, we see that construction, transportation, and storage sectors face the largest percentage of workers with limited or no digital skills, with the education sector faring the best, still albeit at 15% of the combined workforce with limited or no skills. Another important finding is that many of the people who don't have strong digital skills are actually required to use a computer as part of their job. So what does this look like in reality? Well, some qualitative interviews with the National Skills Coalition conducted helped us to understand that. Mostly what happens is that people spend a lot of time trying to cover up for or compensate for their skill gaps. And sometimes they ask coworkers, family members to help them out. And the last slide here highlights an important takeaway, in that you might think of digital skills as being a problem for individual workers, but many of these workers are also supervisors. If supervisors don't have strong digital skills, they can actually contribute to what we call a, quote, productivity bottleneck, which slows down the adoption or use of technology by their entire team. So these workers' skills gaps thus have ripple effects that can dampen productivity and delay adoption of more efficient work practices across the company. So we see here that 1/3 of workers with limited digital skills are supervisors. Yeah. Kind of breeze through these slides, but if you want to browse the full charts and the graphs that I just mentioned, I've provided a link here. We're also going to send out the full PowerPoint to everyone after the presentation, and the links will also be included in there as well. So Amanda, I'm going to pass it back to you to discuss the best ways to teach digital skills and some new federal funding opportunities.
Thanks, Patrick. And yeah, Patrick just gave you a kind of a little taste of the research. There are some more charts and graphs in the longer report that he's linked to here. And we warmly encourage you to steal our charts and graphs. Use them in your grant proposals, use them in your own presentations. Just credit National Skills Coalition when you do. But we have put them out there so that hopefully you can use those to help educate perhaps your board of regents, perhaps your board of directors, perhaps your funders, policymakers, students and learners themselves, whoever your audiences are. Using this data can really help illuminate for them how the work that you're doing fits into these larger national trends. So once people see this data that Patrick's just presented, often the first question we get is, okay, well, how do we fix this, right? How do we help people develop the skills they need to thrive in the jobs they currently have and to meet their additional career aspirations and indeed their broader aspirations, right? We have heard so many stories since the pandemic of both triumph, where families are figuring out how to support their K-12 children in online schooling or connecting with grandparents over a long distance via Zoom. But we've also heard stories of frustration and people not being able to access telehealth services or not being able to participate in important safety training. We heard some really heartbreaking stories early in the pandemic of workers who'd been furloughed from their jobs and who were being allowed to come back only when they completed an online COVID safety training module. And yet, because they didn't have good digital access and skills at home, they weren't able to complete that module and therefore they weren't getting called back to work. So this really does affect real people's lives in very substantive ways. So I touched on this before, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more depth now on the next slide, which is people need both foundational and industry-specific skills, right? So again, foundational, really being comfortable sending emails, being able to sort documents, to create file structures, to download and install a new app on your phone, to protect yourself from phishing scams, right? And this is often referred to as not just sort of a list of foundational skills that people need to memorize or some magic list that if you just know these skills, you'll be all set. It's really about teaching digital resilience. So that if you've used Google Docs and you're suddenly presented with Microsoft Word, you can transfer over, right? The generalizability of knowledge. Oh, if I use the B button to make the font bold on this app, maybe I can do that, the B button on the toolbar in this app. Oh, if I saved my file as a PDF in this app, maybe I can do that in the other app, right? So teaching digital resilience is critically important because technology changes so fast. And because no program can ever hope to be completely up to date with exactly what employers are looking for in this moment, and employers themselves are consistently changing, right? Even in our own organization, Patrick and I have been through, well, Patrick hasn't been here quite as long as I have. I've been through 3 sets of expense reporting software just in the time that I've worked for this organization. And lots of companies do that, right? They're upgrading and changing technology. Industry-specific digital skills, we've talked quite a bit about these already, but again, this is where, and we'll talk about this a bit more in terms of the next slide, your existing avenues for gathering feedback from employers can really be used to help get some more specific insight about digital skill needs, right? If you ask specifically, right, what are the tools that your workers are needing to use on the job? What are the skills that you need people to have in order to be successful? That is critically important. And I know this sounds really simple and obvious, but I'm going to tell you 2 stories that help illuminate why it may not be so simple and obvious. So we did interviews with one key informant who talked about working with a trucking company. And the trucking company during the pandemic switched over to an HR app, and they had not really put digital skills in the job description for the truck drivers that they employed. They just assumed, well, you know, everyone knows how to use technology. And so what happened was their supervisors ended up spending a huge amount of time troubleshooting and supporting their drivers out in the field who were frantically trying to figure out, how do I report my hours so that I can get paid? How do I understand my benefits now that they're all in this app and I'm not getting, you know, the HR information the way I used to? And so it became a giant sort of productivity suck because the company had kind of taken for granted that their incumbent workforce had the skills necessary. And in fact, that was not the case, right? Another company that we've talked to is a Fortune 100 company that has tried for the last couple of years to complete their transition over from paper paychecks to electronic funds transfer for and direct deposit for payroll. And the reason it's taking them a long time is they have 120,000 frontline workers, 60 to 70% of whom don't speak English as a first language, many of whom are only familiar with smartphone technology and not always necessarily very familiar with that. So they're not necessarily comfortable creating a strong password or using 2-factor authentication. Imagine teaching 2-factor authentication to a refugee from Burma who speaks the Karen language, right? It's tough to imagine how to even get the vocabulary translated, much less to contribute and to illustrate what the concept is that you're trying to move towards, right? So no process for learning is ever going to be perfect, but as simple and obvious as it sounds to talk to your employer partners and ask them very literally, what exactly are the digital skills that you expect people to have? Don't trust that they're all going to be listed in a job description. They may not be. Right? And so doing that detective work can really help you design career technical education programs and other programs that are responsive to the kinds of things that your students and workers are going to be encountering as they move out into the workplace. Next slide here. So we do have another longer report, and we've got the URL for that here if you want to dig into it. And again, we'll be sending the slides out to you after today's webinar. But, you know, we've talked about this before. I want to emphasize it again. Contextualized and integrated learning, right? People don't learn computer skills in a vacuum. They learn them because they're relevant to something they urgently need or want to do, right? We all have a story of an older family member who, or a younger family member, who desperately wanted to do something and hadn't previously done the digital skill associated with that, right? So for example, I have a 75-year-old aunt who is using her iPad to access the Major League Baseball app to get her baseball tickets because she's a huge baseball fan. And now the stadium has switched over entirely to electronic ticketing, right? So people have things that motivate them to learn technology. And so we as educators really just need to be thinking about everything we've already known about contextualizing skills and integrating things into whether it was basic skills like reading and math or higher level technical skills, those practices still serve us well when it comes to digital skills. Rapid prototyping is something else that we see a lot of. And some people have asked me, well, isn't this just the fancy version of trial and error? It's a little more formal than trial and error, right? The concept of rapid prototyping is that you're quickly standing up a new training program or new approach, testing it out, getting some feedback, iterating, and sort of adjusting pretty rapidly on the fly. And I have a longer blog post about that I've linked at the end of today's slides if you're the kind of person who sort of likes to geek out about that and wants to go deeper. So those are a few of the highlights of what we're seeing in terms of what's working to build digital skills. I want to turn now to the last segment of our presentation, which is how do we pay for all this, right? Depending on the kind of institution that you're working within or the programs that you're running, you may be at a higher education institution using Pell Grant or other tuition money. You may be at a standalone career technical education training school. You might be in a different type of organization altogether. The new Federal Digital Equity Act can provide funding to support digital skills training. This is part of the Infrastructure Act that Congress passed last November. It's about $3 billion over the next 5 years. And unlike a lot of other funds that come from the federal government to support training, these are not coming from the Department of Labor or the Department of Education. These are coming from the US Department of Commerce, and particularly from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which just rolls right off the tongue very easily there. NTIA is the abbreviation. The law itself is pretty short and sweet. It's actually easy to read. So if you click on the full legislative text link there, it's going to send you to the 1,100-page infrastructure bill. You don't have to read the whole thing, just do a find for Digital Equity Act. And I think it's about 4 pages. And it's pretty straightforward and easy to read. I would encourage you to take a look. But here are the high points. So next slide tells us the timeline. Every state applied to NTIA for small planning grants as of July. In September, NTIA will announce the planning grants by September 29th, and they'll also announce which state agency is going to be taking the lead on digital equity planning for the next year, right? So every state has 12 months to complete a digital equity planning process. A couple of states are on a faster timeline. I know Washington State has a really ambitious deadline. Some other states may also be trying to do this faster, but the feds give you a year. Next summer, NTIA will release a notice of funding opportunity for formula funding to states. So that money will go to the state agency that's overseeing the digital equity plan, and then they'll re-grant it down to the local level. And later next year, NTIA will issue a separate NOFO so that nonprofit organizations, higher education institutions, and others can apply directly to the federal government for competitive grants. So you'll basically get 2 bites of the apple here. You can see what your state agency is putting out as far as re-granting that formula money down to the local level, and you can apply directly to the feds for a competitive grant. Next slide. So your governor's office has already identified which state agency will be the administering entity for the state digital equity planning. In a lot of cases, this is your state broadband office. In some cases, it might be your economic development office, might be your state labor or education agency. I know in at least one case, it is your state library. Shout out to Idaho. So you don't have to wait until September 29th when these are publicly announced. You can reach out now to your contacts in state government to make sure that they're aware of your interest in this topic and that you're on their radar screen. Next slide. In addition to the $3 billion for the Digital Equity Act, there's also $42 billion for the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And this is about actually laying fiber and really putting the infrastructure in place so that every region of the United States truly has broadband access. States are obligated to spend the first chunk of this money getting broadband to unserved and underserved communities. That is, people who don't have broadband at all, or people who currently have slow connections or not very high quality broadband. But states are also allowed to spend a chunk of their BEAD money supporting broadband workforce development. That is, training people for all of the jobs that are required, broadband tower technicians, fiber optics technicians, and on, to actually get this broadband installed across the United States. So this is going to be really variable from state to state. Some states are going to be spending most of their money actually just getting the broadband to people. Other states are pretty well carpeted with broadband already, and so they're going to have a little more money to play around with to spend on workforce development. I've seen some initial data analyses from McKinsey and others that suggest we have some pretty substantial broadband workforce shortages. And so training programs will be particularly important in making sure that people are ready for the broadband jobs that are emerging. So that's one more puzzle piece. We actually have part 2 of this webinar coming up in about a month. So if you want to dig deeper on the funding piece, we'll be talking about that in more depth in that conversation. We have a few minutes left now to take your questions before we wrap up this conversation. So I'd love to open things up. If folks want to drop a question into the chat, please feel free to do that. If you prefer to submit via the Q&A box, you can also do that. Really, whatever function you prefer. So I'll give folks a couple minutes for questions to come through. While we're waiting, I'm actually going to ask Patrick to fast forward through the last 2 slides, just so you can see that we've put our contact information up there for you in case you want to be in touch with either Patrick or me. Patrick's on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast. You should feel free to be in touch with us if you have follow-up questions, or if you want to brag about something cool that you're doing. We are always up for hearing that, because then it can be something we feature in a future presentation. And then we have a resources slide that includes links to our Digital Equity Act sort of 101 fact sheet, our new state policy recommendations on Digital Equity Act and BEAD, some industry-specific fact sheets, and some other resources, including that rapid prototyping blog post that I mentioned. So it looks like we have a question from Mark. What type of state agencies are overseeing their Digital Equity Act funding for colleges to inquire with? So the short answer is the best person to talk to is whoever is already talking to you at the state level, and then they can talk to their state agency peers to get the intel for you. But if you don't already have a state agency contact, start with your governor's office or start with your state broadband office. And we'll find the link for the list of state broadband offices so that Craig and Mark can send that out to everybody who registered for today's conversation, in case folks want to just directly reach out. I will tell you in advance, a lot of the folks in these state broadband offices have been on the job for less than a year. They are scrambling to kind of be the python digesting the pig, which is this huge lump of federal funding that's coming at them. And they're very small offices in many cases, right? 1 staff member, 3 staff members. So they're really tiny state agencies compared to the size, say, of a state labor agency or a state education agency. So if you have a contact in state government, start with them and ask them, you know, hey, can you find out who our governor has appointed to oversee digital equity planning? If you don't already have a contact in state government, reach out to your governor's office and ask that question. Great question. Any other questions that folks have? We scheduled this as a 45-minute webinar because we knew it was a lot of dense information and we didn't want to kind of drown you in too much detail. So if folks don't have questions now, that's fine, but I wanted to leave breathing room in case there were other questions that had bubbled up for people. In addition, if you're doing anything interesting on digital skills, feel free to drop that into the chat as well. We'd love to hear about it. All right, it looks like we've answered your immediate questions, so we are delighted to hear that. We thank you for your participation. I'm going to turn things back over to Craig now to go ahead and close us out.
Well, Amanda and Patrick, I can't tell you how much this has been insightful and enlightening for myself, as well as I hope all the attendees. I look forward to part 2, September 27th, and it'll be at 2 p.m. Eastern time, not 3. I remember because of some other things you're involved with, but our partnership with you, I just want to keep it growing, and I hope all of our attendees today spread the great word of all the great work you're doing. And again, we will send out the PowerPoint PDF to all attendees today, as you mentioned earlier, and we will also have the recorded version of this up on our website and then down to you to share with your networks as well by Monday or Tuesday next week at the latest. So without further ado, I just want to thank you and Patrick and Mark for getting us together, and anything in between now and September 27th, please let us know if you need. But we really appreciate all the good work you're doing and your expertise sharing today with our members. All right. I guess we'll sign off until the next time. Thanks so much. Take care. Have a great rest of the week.